Friends, friends, if I could have your attention. Friends, I'm so sorry to do this to you. Friends, can I have your attention? Thank you. I'm so sorry to do this for you, but we have some technical difficulties with this door, which means we can't close this wall, which means we need to have this forum because Todd is prepared for it. So if you can grab your stuff and move into that room, that will be fine. And then we will, I'm going to be broadcasting it here, not because I don't want you to talk, but I just want you to not be able to interrupt that. So sorry. Thank you so much.
Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started here as they continue to work on the door. We got coffee hour down to a low roar over there. Thank you, everybody, for your birthday wishes. I will say, however, I have no idea where Bill got that number from that he mentioned. Just want to pass this off to Todd Estes for the last of this 3 series that he's been doing on moderation. And how many here have heard that the Episcopal Church comes from the Anglican Church, which came out of Henry VIII's divorce? Yes, oh yes, that's it. I want to suggest to you that the birth of the Episcopal Anglican tradition of Christianity came not from that moment, but from a few monarchs later when Queen Elizabeth established what was known as the Elizabethan settlement, where she settled the controversy in England between whether we would be Protestant or whether they would be Protestant or Catholic. She said, we'll be both. It was the beginning of a kind of middle way church that continues to be, I think, in our ethos. And so when Todd was talking about doing this class on the art of moderation, it seemed to be quite obvious. Let's talk about how that role of that has had in the founding of this church as well. So, without any further ado, I'm passing this over to Professor Estes. Come on in.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, let me again thank Father Chris for the introduction and the opportunity to speak with you today. Because I often forget to make important announcements, let me do these up front so I don't forget and miss anything at the end. I'd just like to thank, again, Father Bill and Father Chris and Pastor Manisha for this opportunity to speak and to do these forums with you. I'm most especially grateful to all of you for coming and for your interest, for your great questions, and for following up on things. It's a great honor to be able to do this as a new member of the church, to be able to meet people and present, and it's a great honor there. My wife, Kathy, I'm very grateful for because she's heard all this multiple times over the years. In the earlier parts of our marriage, the rough drafts, the semi-rough drafts, the polished versions, and she certainly helped me talk through and work through these things as well. So she's doing brave service to be here for yet another version of this talk. I also just wanted to say I'm always grateful to have emails, and on your handout, the syllabus there, you'll find my email address at Oakland. If you ever want to write, if you have a question about something or you come across a book that you've read that's really striking, you think I'd be interested in it, please send that to me, and please write to me and reach out. If you're ever looking for a recommendation on a particular historical topic in my field, I'm always happy to recommend readings and books to you that way. And also, I might mention too, next semester, starting in January, I'm actually teaching a class on the American founding, which is a study of the American founding. We'll look at the Articles of Confederation, the drive for a new constitution, the Constitutional Convention, the convention itself, and the ratification debate, up through the Bill of Rights. So it'll be a very condensed chronological period of time, but an awful lot of stuff will be in there. And in a sense, a lot of the things we've just kind of hinted at here in these programs I'll be teaching more at length in those classes. This is only to say I'm always happy to have guests or visitors in my classroom. I sometimes have former colleagues who are interested in a particular time period and come back, or former students who come back. I've got a student this next semester who's taking a gap year between undergrad and law school and wanted to come sit in on the class, so he will be there as well, sort of auditing the class. So if anybody's ever interested in a class on the American founding, you'd like to hear a little more, or just have another college experience, let me know. Write to me. I'll send you the dates and times and room numbers and all that good stuff. But I would be very happy to have you there as a guest or a visitor sometime in class.
Do you know whether it's evening or day?
It is daytime. I think it's Monday, Wednesday, Friday, maybe 10:40 to 12 or something like that, somewhere in that time period. I think that's the class, but definitely daytimes. Today, of course, we're talking about the third part of this series, which is on the Episcopal DNA in the American founding. And I'm very grateful for Father Chris's introduction, which has kind of nicely set up some of what we're trying to do here today. And in many ways, in case you do want to join the others and go to the other room for coffee hour and talk to your friends and have snacks and cookies, let me give you the really quick version of this lecture by referring you to this incredible portrait. This is sort of George Washington propaganda, we might say. And I hope you can all see it. I didn't have time to get it done in time to have it reproduced. But this is essentially a theme that I'll be talking about today. And if I had to sum this up just very briefly, and we will unpack all this and go into enormous detail, probably more than you wanted on a Sunday morning, but the short version of this picture goes something like this. George Washington, God, ascending to heaven, angels, the Constitution, the United States, the American Revolution, Federalists, Episcopalians, Amen. So that's the short version. If anyone needs to leave or get to other football games or things like that, you've got the short version. And we'll say a little bit more about those things, but in many ways, I think this picture does capture the serious theme I want to get at today, which is the sort of intermingling of religion and politics, but a certain kind of religion and a certain kind of politics in the early American Republic. And so I want to talk today about the staggeringly large role that Episcopalians played in the early American Republic. I want to talk about some of the key Episcopalians who held high offices in the nation's early government. I want to do a couple of brief case studies, one of George Washington, one of John Jay, two very prominent Episcopalians and certainly prominent founders as well. Then I'd like to talk a little bit more about the role of the clergy in the early Republic. Because although, as we'll see, there were no clergymen who were delegates to the Constitutional Convention, the clergy themselves were very prominent political actors, and they were seen as tremendously important by, first of all, Federalist and Anti-Federalist in the debates over the Constitution we've been talking about the last several weeks, and then also in the early Republic in the first party system, where a lot of those Federalists of the Constitution debate became Federalist Party members of the first party system, party of Washington, Hamilton, Adams, etc. And so many of those clergy became very active themselves in politics, but not uncontroversially, because then as now, the idea of what is the proper role for clergy in politics, what is the right mix, is there a mix, should there be a firm line, a wall of separation between church and state, or should that be not much of a wall at all or a very permeable boundary? Those are things we want to talk about and get into some of the controversies. So let's start with an important fact, I think, that Father Bill alluded to today in his announcement during the service, and that is the hugely prominent role played by large numbers of Episcopalians in the American founding. The Constitutional Convention was held in Philadelphia from May until September of 1787. Depending on how you count, somewhere between 50 and 70% of the delegates were Episcopalian. 50 to 70%. I'm not very good at my math, but that's a lot. That's more than half. And it's not just that Episcopalians were there in numbers as backbenchers, they were extremely prominent members of the convention. The man presiding over the convention was George Washington of Virginia, an Episcopalian, as we'll talk about more. Washington would come in every day, call the convention to order from his chair up front, but because he was very concerned about seeming to be power hungry, he would then leave that chair and go sit with the Virginia delegation, his friends and colleagues from home. And then he would call the convention to adjourn, and so on the next several days. The delegate who spoke the most at Philadelphia and had a tremendous amount, he's really a very unsung, unheralded, but deserves much more notoriety. The delegate who made the most speeches at the convention was James Wilson of Pennsylvania, an Episcopalian. The delegate who spoke second most frequently at the convention was Gouverneur Morris, an Episcopalian. In fact, it is Wilson and Morris who drafted arguably what is the most important part of the Constitution, which is the preamble, which famously declares that this is a constitution by and for the American people, not by and for the states, we the people. The famous words, those authors, that idea, that preamble, that concept came from Wilson and Morris, who were part of the Committee on Style, Committee on Detail, some of those congressional committees that were so significant. Other members of the delegation at Philadelphia were not perhaps as prominent as Washington and Morris and Wilson, but nonetheless, as I said, 50 to 70% of the delegates at Philadelphia were Episcopalians. So in some way, it is fair to say that the Constitution is our Constitution. We wrote that. Our predecessors wrote that. They had an awful lot to do with that. And as we'll see, they continued in service in the American nation in the early years of the new government. John Jay, who we'll talk about, we've already talked about him a lot politically, we'll talk about him today religiously as well. Jay, of course, could have had his choice of jobs. Washington basically said, okay, we're starting the new government, where do you want to be? I want you in this government, you're one of my closest advisors, you pick your office. You can be in the cabinet, you can be wherever. And Jay said, I'd like to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. One of his benchmates on the first Supreme Court was James Wilson, who was considered the most brilliant lawyer of his era. He wrote some very famous law lectures and delivered those. Wilson was a brilliant political thinker. The other thing that Wilson had done during the ratification debates, he gave a speech outside Constitutional Hall in Philadelphia in October of 1787. And that speech became the single most widely reprinted document in the entire ratification debate. It was reprinted in every state. It was reprinted multiple times, pamphlets, broadsides, etc. That speech also influenced Federalist speakers in later conventions and later Federalist writers in the ratification debate. And that speech by Wilson, as I said, again, the single most widely reprinted document of the ratification debate. It was not the Federalist Papers, it was not Brutus or Letters from a Federal Farmer or any of the other things that are more famous. But if you were the average American newspaper reader at the time, you would probably not have seen the Federalist Papers, but you almost certainly would have come across James Wilson's speech. James Wilson, Episcopalian. Also, an early leader in Virginia politically, and then in 1801, perhaps the most famous, longest lasting Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice was John Marshall, a Federalist and an Episcopalian. The greatest Federalist speaker of the early Republic was a congressman named Fisher Ames, Episcopalian. Oh, Ames, by the way, was also a delegate at the Constitutional Convention. He was part of the 50 to 75%. Ames was also a member of the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, which, as I've suggested before, was the crucial ratifying convention where the idea of dropping the shoulder, of looking for compromise, making conciliations, the Massachusetts Convention is the first where that practice was undertaken. And Ames was one of the people who, despite being a strong Federalist, was also someone who struck a softer tone, worked toward compromise, and helped to bring on anti-Federalists to the ratifying cause as well. Ames got his greatest fame, though, as an orator, as a speaker. How good was Ames? Ames gave a speech in 1796 on the floor of Congress on the Jay Treaty. He was in favor of that, as were the Federalists, but it was a very unpopular treaty. Ames was trying to win approval for funding to put the treaty into operation. And Ames gave a speech that was so highly regarded that it moved John Adams to tears. And Adams was not the only one moved to tears by that speech. It became widely reprinted, widely distributed, and became famous, so much so that Abraham Lincoln is reported to have studied Ames's speech on the Jay Treaty when he himself was learning, decades later, public speaking and rhetoric himself. Fisher Ames is not someone we know today, although I have a soft spot in my heart for him because my very first published professional article was on Fisher Ames and the Jay Treaty speech. So my entire career, in some ways, has started with Fisher Ames and continues to Fisher Ames this day. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, again, just not just the numbers, because the sheer numbers of Episcopalians at the convention, drafting the Constitution, arguing for it, serving in the various congressional bodies, serving in the new national government is really a staggering thing. And I want to emphasize again this sort of, as Father Chris very nicely put it, this kind of both and thinking, as opposed to either or thinking. Because if we go back and think about what we've talked about the past couple of weeks, looking at moderation and looking at the compromise and amendments and sort of trying to bring critics on board to ratify a document they may not have been crazy about in the first place, I think there's something about that moderate impulse and moderate temperament and spirit of mind that is very important. And again, I want to be careful not to make an argument that sounds like if we hadn't had Episcopalians, we never would have had a constitution, therefore no country, therefore none of this. That would be a slight exaggeration, just a slight, but yet an exaggeration. And as a professional historian, I have to be careful how much I claim for certain things here. But I think, again, certainly, there is a significance to the fact that so many Episcopalians participated in the key moments of the American founding. And the fact that the Episcopal faith also blended with a kind of political faith of moderation and conciliation and compromise in ways that helped to reinforce a political message and reinforce a religious message, borrowing some from both and combining them. So that this became, as I think we know, a very eclectic sort of religion, one that does not have firm absolutes or you can't do this or you must do that. That kind of broad-mindedness, I think, was very important. And one of the questions that we can never fully separate is how much of what George Washington and John Jay and Wilson and Morris and these others did was influenced by the fact that they were Episcopalians, how much was influenced by the fact that they were Federalists. I'm not sure that's a line where we can really say, well, this stops here and the other picks up at that point. I think it's a lot murkier, a lot fuzzier than that, harder to tell where the religious influence, the Episcopal influence, ends off and the political influence comes in. Nonetheless, what I want to do a little bit today is to talk about George Washington and John Jay, just to pick two prominent examples, as Episcopalians, and talk about their thinking, how they worshiped, how religion fit into their lives, and how in many ways, if what I'm suggesting about moderation and the debate over the Constitution, if that is persuasive and correct, then we want to talk about how that may have been shaped by their Episcopal backgrounds. Claire?
I know this is not an aside, but as an historian, it's important to define definitions.
Mm-hmm.
So when did the term Episcopalian start, and when did it supersede the term Anglican?
Well, this is part of what makes that accounting of 50 to 70% difficult, because historians would count people who identified as Anglican still or Episcopalian, which was a term, Father Chris, you may know this best, having just taught a class, when that term comes in. My sense is it's very early. I mean, they're creating the American Episcopal Church. in the 1780s.
It was very hard to be a member of the Church of England when you're at war.
Yeah, exactly.
That was I don't know the exact date.
Yeah, I think it's the 1780s, when the term came in. The Episcopal Church was created then. When the term Episcopalian was used by some people immediately as a way of distinguishing between themselves and the British and loyalists and things like that. And so some people continue to identify as Anglican, some people can identify as Anglican Episcopal, but essentially these are the same sort of strain. It's simply that the Anglican impulse was sort of, in part by people like John Jay, transformed into something that could be in the right side of the American Revolution, so that they would not be identified with the loyalist in Great Britain and the old ways of doing things. Let's talk about George Washington a little bit. Washington in 1762 became a vestryman of his Truro Parish Church, a post that he held for 22 years. Now that seems like a long time to serve on vestry, but can you imagine being the person who would go to George Washington and say, "Thank you for your service, but we're going to go in a different direction and replace you"? That would be a hard thing to do with someone of Washington's stature. Now, the 12-man vestry that Washington served on, of course, does what vestries do, overserves the matters of the church, financial and others. Washington was also a major contributor. He completed, when the church was completed, he bought two pews for the church and contributed repeatedly to the church as well. He also served 3 terms as what was called a church warden, which was primarily a post where he was expected to care for poor people and orphans. Now, his home at Mount Vernon, as you know, was so large, took up so much space, that it sprawled into another parish as well, Christ Church in Alexandria. And because George Washington was George Washington, he served on vestry there as well. So he was simultaneously a member of the vestry at 2 parishes, long serving in both places, because again, if you're George Washington, who is going to go to you and say, again, "Thank you for serving, but we will go in a different direction"? There are some other mysteries about Washington's religious beliefs. He was very careful to refrain from public statements enjoining prayer or the tenets and documents of Christianity. He also is someone who, for a variety of reasons, which was fairly typical, I've learned at the time, did not regularly take communion. In part, communion was a rarer service. There were lots of rites and rituals involved in that. It apparently created anxiety for parishioners, fearing they might do the wrong thing or not respond in the right way or make the right motion. But Washington also seemed to be considered communion to be a really overt act of an expression of Christianity. And Washington, as many of you know from reading about him, was a man who was famously reserved, famously sort of, if not cold, at least tended to hold back his emotions. And he considered communion to be a sort of overt act of Christianity, which he just seemed not to feel comfortable with. Some have accused Washington of being a deist, someone who believed that God created the universe and then sort of sat back and watched it work. There's really, according to historians, no real evidence that that is the case at all. He never identified himself as that. He never spoke in those terms. He was clearly a Christian from things he has written and said in private. And again, he always gave great thanks to divine providence, to the idea of a God who is clearly operating at work in the universe, whether it was saving Washington's life in military conflicts or looking over the new nation at the time of the Constitution. Again, this picture, again, sort of captures it all of the kind of way that Washington was seen by others and the way that he easily conflated the spiritual, the political, and many other realms as well. The other things about Washington is, one of the things about him is his mutual toleration, his religious toleration. One of the documents I've given you, which I want to talk about in a few minutes, is a very famous letter he wrote to a Hebrew congregation. And I want to offer that as an example of that tolerance. Washington was himself very deeply tolerant of other religions, other walks of life, other ways of doing things. He did not think that government, although he was a committed Episcopalian himself, as I said, he served on the vestry at not one but two churches. Washington was very clearly an Episcopalian himself, but the idea that government should somehow show favor on this or that denomination was not something he was comfortable with at all. Frequently, if he was in a town when he was traveling that did not have an Episcopal church, he would very happily go and worship at other houses of worship. So Washington was often seen at other churches during his time in the 1780s, during his time even as president in the 1790s, where he spent a fair amount of it on various tours of the country, or going from Philadelphia back to his home at Mount Vernon. Washington also famously loathed any kind of religious fanaticism. Any sort of fanatical appeals to religion or fanatical religious behavior was, for the very deeply reserved Washington, just simply made him very uncomfortable. And so in many ways, the service, the prayer book, the hymnals, the way the Episcopal Church conducted services was ideal for Washington. Seriousness of intent, high intellectual content, but also a kind of emotional reserve that not all other churches had. And as I said, Washington never thought about condemning others and was very happy to attend others. By the way, one thing about George Washington that seems to have troubled at least a couple of his rectors, Washington was not always a faithful attendee of church. He was always in the vestry, but he didn't always attend services. Now that's partly because Washington had a lot going on. He had various jobs to carry out during the war and afterwards, certainly as president, and Washington was not always in the pew every Sunday, even though he bought pews and helped out and did all these things. So his record of church attendance was not outstanding. But there's no question, again, of his commitment and his lifelong belief in that. And again, birth, marriage, death, all of these, his wedding, all of these kinds of key aspects of life were all conducted through the Anglican or then Episcopal Church. I want to talk briefly about John Jay, who is another prominent Episcopalian at the founding, and again sort of make some observations about him. Jay was, for the most part, extremely tolerant also of other religions, just as was Washington, with one exception. Jay had apparently a lifelong difficulty with Catholics because he feared that Catholics could simply not be loyal to the United States because they would be loyal, he thought, to the Pope. And so he was a proponent of several. At the time, the New York was doing its state convention to draft the state constitution back in 1777. Jay proposed a number of very strong anti-Catholic amendments because he believed, again, that it was simply America was for people who were clearly committed to the Americans above all else, committed to the Constitution, committed to the nation. And Jay seems to have honestly believed that Catholics could not make that same pledge, and therefore they could rightly be discriminated against. Now, Jay was in the minority in that. He was outvoted by others, but that hostility to Catholicism, again tied to matters of patriotism and loyalty, was something that did not seem to leave Jay very quickly. That simply continued to bother him for much of his life. In other ways, and I bring that up because it's, I think, an important point to note about Jay and his Episcopalian tendencies there, but in all other ways, I think Jay was this, in many ways, model of moderation and tolerance. He was very tolerant of Jews, very tolerant of other religious groups, very tolerant of other denominations. Like Washington, it offended him to think about any one denomination being favored in some way by the national government in any other way, or using the power of the state to harass or upset or attack people for other measures as well. And Jay, again, continued to serve in his church as well. John Jay was also a vestryman at his church, which happened to be Trinity Episcopal Church in New York City, a very famous one where Jay's father had served as a vestryman and his grandfather had served as vestryman. And I believe, I can't say this with 100% certainty, but I think at least one of his sons was also on vestry as well. So 4 generations of Jays on the vestry at Trinity Church. Jay, again, was well regarded, well thought of, and far more so than Washington. Jay was more comfortable with sort of outgoing expressions of religion, outgoing displays of religion. He was someone who spoke in terms that, for example, Washington never used. There is no evidence from his writings that George Washington may have said this, but he seems never to have written the words Jesus or Christ or Jesus Christ in his writings. That's Washington. Jay did some of that, but Jay also sort of approached matters the way that Washington did by referring more generally and more broadly to providence or providential blessings and referring to a God in a general sense rather than to Jesus Christ as a Savior. And in that sense, Jay was more open, more, what should we say, more at ease, I think, with those kinds of matters of personal religion carrying over into to public matters. Now, if we can turn to, if you have in your documents there and want to pull this up, let me just call your attention to the letter to the Hebrew congregation. It's from the Founders Online document. And by the way, if anybody is ever looking for a great source for founders' statements, or you want to read a document or an address or things like that, Founders Online is a great online source. It's based on and taken from all the founders' papers and those kinds of things. It's a wonderful resource. It sort of puts it all together in one place online and saves an awful lot of having to jump around to multiple volumes and things like that. But I want to call up this letter, Washington to the Hebrew congregation. This is in 1790, so Washington is already now in his second year of being president. And I've given you 2 pages of this document. And if you look at the second page, I've underlined this as well. This is in response to a letter that the Hebrew congregation sent to him. And the letter, as it says, essentially seems to say, we are committed to you, we are committed to the nation, we like where we are, we hope that you will continue to look after the nation and look after us, and we hope that we will be allowed to practice our religion free of harassment, free of trepidation, free of problems in many ways. Washington got that letter and penned his response. And I just want to note a couple things about the response and then suggest how it echoes exactly what the Hebrew congregation had written to him, and offer this up as an example of moderation in practice by George Washington. He says, this is from Washington to the Hebrew congregation, I've received your address with great satisfaction. If we have the wisdom to make the best use of our opportunities, he says, we cannot fail, under the just administration of a good government, to become a great and happy people. Citizens of the United States have a right to applaud themselves, he says, for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy. Therefore, we think broadly. We accept many. We do not have firm absolutes or rigid either-or behavior, the both and that Father Chris has mentioned before. And he goes on. It is now no more spoken that toleration is spoken of, he says, as if it were the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent rights. In other words, these are not rights that are given to people by other people or by other groups. These are inherent rights that we all have. Inherent rights that we all have. For happily, he says, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves, basically show themselves to be good citizens on giving and on all occasions their effectual support. Now that's a very strong statement by Washington, opposing religious bigotry, making it clear that he, as leader of the government, will tolerate none of that in fact what the United States stands for is the opposite of bigotry, but rather toleration. But what's really interesting, I think, is that he is essentially, if we look at that second page of this document, quoting back to the Hebrew congregation what they had written to him. They had used that same language about how they were proud to be part of a government to which bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but generously affording to all liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. And if you'll notice, what Washington does is to slightly change the language a bit, but he basically echoes back to them what they had said to him. And that, as I think I've suggested in previous weeks, is a great way of performing moderation, of telling your adversary or your rival, or the person you're debating, by quoting their words, by talking to them, by listening to them, by reading those words back. It's what John Jay had done with Anti-Federalists when he, as one historian said, tried to make it a point to sound both Federalist and Anti-Federalist themes so that each side could hear themselves in his letter and his address. And I think what Washington is doing here by quoting or paraphrasing very closely the language of what the Hebrew congregation had sent to him, what he is doing is essentially saying, I endorse your views, I support your views, I'm going to borrow from your language and your ideas, and I'm going to use that in my reply to you. It's a way of making it clear that the Hebrew congregation was seen and heard and valued, and that in fact what he was doing to them was saying, I take your words, I endorse those, and I appreciate your support for me and this government. We will continue to work in this way, and in fact he is again saying the very same thing that he had said there as well. Now that document, I think again, as we've noted, no extremes or absolutes in that, and I think this is the broader connection perhaps between Episcopalians and Federalists, the first governing party of the country in the 1790s. A kind of flexibility, a kind of moderation, a kind of tolerance, a kind of conciliation. That's what we had seen practiced at the Philadelphia Convention. That's what we had seen practiced at the various ratifying conventions. And I think at least on this particular document as well, we can see Washington doing the same thing, continuing that, echoing that, carrying out that point. Yes, a question?
Isn't this really, though, toleration? It's not just toleration. I mean, there was a lot of debate about toleration versus really a greater equality. This is affirming really the equality of this Jewish community, not just tolerating them, because that was also a practice. I look at John Henry in Virginia, toleration, yes, but not recognizing the equality of the claim of certainly non-Christian or non-Protestants. So this is really moderation plus, isn't it? And it's not just tolerance, it's an embrace, a much greater embrace of the Jewish population as equal in standing in all rights and privileges of being a part of the nation.
Absolutely. It's a very good point, because it is very clearly a statement of inclusion, of acceptance, and not just of toleration. It does fit under that heading as an example of that, but you're quite right. It's a much broader kind of endorsement and claim. And deeply significant, again, coming from not just the president, but coming from George Washington. And again, the kind of figure he was, the kind of heroic leader he had been in the Revolution, in the post-revolutionary period, at the convention, during ratification, and now as the nation's first president. It's a very strong statement. And again, because this was ideas like this were sometimes published in other forums as well, it's an example of Washington saying, again, we're all equal here. We're all under the Constitution, but we're also all under God. We are Americans here, and in this country, in this place, we will not tolerate that kind of bigotry. Now, did that mean there was no religious bigotry? Of course not. Did that mean that some people were rigidly intolerant? Of course not. But these words coming from the president, and not just a president, but George Washington, I think these were tremendously significant, as well as examples of a kind of moderating tendency or moderating performance. Now, let me say just a few more things. I want to get to questions, and I know we want to talk here, and I've purposely sort of cut back on what I wanted to talk about here. But let me sort of suggest just sort of briefly some things about the role of the clergy in the ratification debates. As I mentioned, there were a lot of different occupational groups represented at the Philadelphia Convention. Lots of lawyers, local government officials, people who were planters, things like that. But there were no clergymen at the Philadelphia Convention. However, clergy were seen by both the Federalist supporters of the Constitution and by anti-Federalist critics of the Constitution as being a very important, what we might call, interest group in American society. Because clergy obviously were influential. They could obviously sway or direct their parishioners this way or that way politically, this way or that way on the great issues of the day. And so both Federalist and anti-Federalist came to really value endorsements of the Constitution, if you were a Federalist, by clergy, or criticisms of the Constitution by anti-Federalist, if you were part of the clergy. Now, many clergy on the Federalist side supported the Constitution, not only Episcopalians, although Episcopalians clergy certainly led the way in some cases there, but many other denominations. As I said, this was not an Episcopal-only Constitution by any way, shape, or form. But nonetheless, many of the early efforts in the ratification debate did involve publicizing the views of clergy who were either pro or anti with the Constitution. Clergy were also sought out by many political leaders of both the Federalist and anti-Federalist movements, knowing that an endorsement or a criticism could be enormously valuable in those ways. Now, there also are ways, and again, there's a wonderful book on this, which I have listed in your bibliography by Spencer McBride, called Pulpit and Nation, I think is the title. And Spencer McBride's got a great chapter there about the role of clergy in the ratification debate. So if you want to read a lot more about that, as I said, I want to open things up to discussion and conversation here shortly. But just drawing briefly on McBride's work on ratification, he makes the point that many anti-Federalist clergy saw, or feared rather, a kind of establishment of religious preference for those in power. And since many anti-Federalists tended to be those of, say, Baptist or Methodist faith or other Protestant denominations that were not as well connected as, say, Episcopalians or some others, because of that, there were some anti-Federalists who criticized the Constitution, fearing that there might be a tilting or a shading to favor some groups at the expense of others. And so they were always in favor of a far clearer kind of statement about the role of religion, whether there should be a separation or not of church and state. And so part of the criticism of the Constitution by some anti-Federalist clergy was along those lines. However, probably an even more frequent complaint of the anti-Federalist clergy pertaining to the Constitution was that it does not mention the word God. And they said, how could we set up a government? How could we set up a frame of government that does not mention God? Therefore, this Constitution is flawed and should be defeated. The other great fear that some anti-Federalist clergy had of the Constitution, again, is that it would favor the kinds of people who might not always be good Christians. And this comes up in the matter was often debated. I mean, it's staggering how frequently this came up in the debates at the state level over the Constitution, whether or not there should be a religious test. And the religious test would be for, basically, are you a Christian? And some people said, well, we don't need that because most of Americans at the time were Christians in some broad form, so that's not really an issue. And others said, well, we don't need to ask that because that's a matter for an individual conscience. Let people worship how they want to. That's not really what we're doing here. And so we don't need a religious test. But partly because God was not mentioned in the Constitution, and partly for the fear that, as some delegates pointed out, well, this means there could be Jews or Muslims or Catholics who could be elected to the political offices. There might even be someday a Catholic president or a Jewish president or a Muslim president. Unless we specifically ban it, they said, by having a religious test that you have to take and swear to proclaim that you're a Christian, that could be problematic down the road. Federalist clergy, and again, many Episcopal clergy stepped forward on this matter as well in this debate and said, basically, we don't need that We don't need that. If that happens, that happens. But we need to tolerate and respect. There needs to be, again, a sense of equality of the religious groups. And that's simply something that government is not going to take sides on, is not going to be an arbiter or a referee on at all. And so in those matters, that question of a religious test became very powerful. But again, many anti-federalists really insisted, this was true in Massachusetts, it was true in other states as well, where the question was, should there be a religious test? Should you have to prove and state that you're a Christian? Because, or should there be a clause in the Constitution prohibiting specifically non-Christians from ever being office holders, ever being presidents? Now that gets into obviously much larger, much broader questions than what we're focused on here. But that role of the clergy in the ratification debate pushed those issues into the discussion. And just as typically Federalist clergy would say, that's not really what we're about. We don't really want to set up tests or things like that. That's not really the best way to go about thinking about this matter. Religion is a private matter. It's a matter of conscience. We should leave that up to individual consciences. The other great matter that clergy weighed in on was this question, which again has not gone away certainly, about the link between religion and morality. Must you be religious to be a moral person? And how do you define those terms? How do you screen for those terms? How do you think about those questions of morality and religion? How can you think about those, and how should the nation approach this in this early debate? Now, those were some of the ways, and again, McBride has got far more detail on this, so I would strongly recommend that chapter in that book. But those were some of the ways in which the clergy identified with either Federalist or Anti-Federalist, and the ways that they helped to inject into the debate some key issues that were not about, the number of representatives or the size of districts or forms of government or the powers of the executive or those kinds of things. So all of these kinds of religious issues were, I think of them as sort of subterranean parts of the debate. They were rarely front and center. They were not discussed as often. They were not written about as often as matters of representation or qualifications for office or powers of the various branches of government or checks and balances or these kinds of things. But they were clearly on people's minds. They were clearly part of these debates, and they grew clearly out of this anti-Federalist and Federalist debates over the Constitution and ratification. Once the Constitution was ratified, once it was ratified and the new nation and the new government went into practice in 1789, the clergy's role in politics did not go away. Clergy, again, the two new parties that came up were the Federalist, which in many ways were the extension of the Federalist from 1787 and the debate over the Constitution. Generally, those Federalists became Federalist in the new government as well. The critics of the new government were not called anti-Federalist, but they were called Democratic Republicans or Republicans or Jeffersonians. It's very confusing, and my students always have a difficult time with this because they said, wait a minute, I thought they were this, and then later they should switch and this becomes something else. So it is confusing, but in the first new system, there were clergy identified with the Federalists and George Washington, responsible for, again, propagating ideas and notions and senses like this of George Washington at his death, ascending into heaven on the wings of angels, and these sorts of things, and the blending of these different forces and elements. And many Jeffersonian clergy who specifically were worried about establishment of religion, were worried about religious freedom and toleration, were worried about being parts of Protestant groups that were not that numerous, and therefore worried that they might be discriminated against, and were fighting for religious freedoms and religious protections. And also those groups on the Democratic Republican side tended to become aligned with Jeffersonian political philosophies, which tended to be decentralized to favor a lessening of power and consolidated authority at the national level and more power at the state level, which tended to promote the advancement of what we might call ordinary citizens above those people like the Jays and the Washingtons and the Hamiltons and Madisons and people of that ilk. And so there tended to be a far greater connection between clergy and their roles and their politics. And this came out in the sermons they preached and the addresses that they gave. Federalist clergy in the 1790s, and I just want to work through some of this stuff kind of briefly here. Federalists in the 1790s, the clergy were very concerned about the impact of the French Revolution, because the French Revolution represented to them chaos, violence, anarchy, deism, atheism, anti-clericalism, all kinds of stuff that they were horrified by. It also represented to them an assault on power, an assault on authority, an assault on order. And so for many clergy in the 1790s, particularly Federalist clergy, they stood behind Washington and the Federalists, who themselves eventually were opposed to the actions of the French Revolution. At the beginning, all Americans warmly welcomed it. We saw that France is a sister republic. We fought England, they fought England, we're on the same side here. But over time, the French Revolution, it seemed to many Americans, was spinning out of control, becoming about different kinds of things, and so that became very concerning to them. Federalist clergy made no apologies about speaking very brashly and openly from their pulpits to the parishioners about political matters. And while not all of them said, vote Federalist in so many words, it would be impossible to leave the church services in some of these churches, not only Episcopalian, but other churches as well, and not come away with a message that the way to vote politically was to vote for Federalist, that that's going to be a way of striking back, pushing back against the things that you didn't like or didn't concern or didn't care for. Federalist clergy also typically gave election day sermons, which sometimes did tell people the right way to vote. And so in all these matters in the 1790s, clergy were very active politically. They used their pulpits for these reasons, not to conciliate, not to have a sort of big tent approach, not to try to bring people together in a way, but to advocate for a particular side in a partisan political conflict in the 1790s between Federalist and Democratic Republicans. This upset many people, some of whom claim that we now have, quote, clergy are the tools of the Federalists, and others bemoan the fact that priests have now become made politicians. And for many Americans, this was a disgusting and upsetting development, because for many, they wanted their church service and their politics to remain separate, but in some cases, at least, it was the clergy who were driving those and bringing them together. As I had said, most Episcopal clergy that we have records of, most Episcopal clergy tended to be very closely identified with the Federalist Party. Perhaps not surprising, the party of Washington, Jay, Hamilton, Fisher Ames, Morris, Wilson, all of these people tended to support the party in the 1790s that grew out of those debates over the Constitution in the 1780s. And the other thing, as I think we've talked before in a previous lecture here, was that moderation, which worked at the time of the Constitution, collapsed pretty quickly in the 1790s because of the overheated nature of partisan politics. And so everything sort of got upset in the 1790s, and moderation was very hard to find coming from any voices on any matters the deeper we got into the decade itself. 1796 was the first contested presidential election between the Federalist John Adams and the Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson. As you'll recall, Adams wound up with the most votes, so he became president. Jefferson got the second most votes, so he became vice president, and so you had a president and a vice president of different political parties. That worked out about as well as you would expect. And of course, Jefferson, in the rematch 4 years later, was able to defeat Adams in 1800 and win that election and sort of turn things in a very different direction. Part of what made Jefferson's rise possible is a growing democratization of the American electorate and the American nation, and also a growing democratization, we might say, of American Christianity. All of these kinds of things tended to point against the idea of elite control, of elite leadership. They tended to value people like Jefferson over people like Hamilton. They tended to value eventually people like Andrew Jackson over people like John Quincy Adams. They tended to promote the rise of the common man, as it was called at the time. They tended to promote a very democratic politics, both a small d democratic, but also in terms of partisanship, a capital D Democratic Party. The party of Andrew Jackson was the dominant party of what became the second political party system in the years after 1815, right up until the eve of the Civil War. The other great event happening religiously at the time was the Second Great Awakening, which again was about traveling preachers, ministers going from place to place, preaching the gospel, preaching their sermons. This had a democratizing effect on religion as well. And so for many Federalists who died out as a political party after 1816, and for many Episcopalians, they remained Episcopalians, but their size and their influence shrank pretty dramatically. In the new in the new religious landscape of the 19th century, they often found themselves disadvantaged, whereas in the 1770s, 80s, and 90s, they had been advantaged by their place, their numbers, their influence, and their positions. And that continued for quite some time and drove many Federalists and many Anglican clergy as well to turn to things like influencing culture and influencing religion, setting up schools and academies, writing books and novels and literature, turning to voluntary activities. John Jay, who lived until 1836, I think, was very active in voluntary movements, as were his sons. And that became for many Episcopalians the way to advance their ideas and their cause, since they had a difficult time winning political office sometimes or influencing those people who did win political office. And so there was a move away from that. And then lastly, and I want to wrap things up here, just for fun, I've given you what I've always thought of as a neat little piece to read from a book by Nicholas Lehman, who's studying the rise of the SAT, something that is the bane of all high school students around the country and has been for years. This is a book by him called The Big Test, and it's a study of the people who created the organization that founded the SAT and started that institution. It's a great book, a fascinating book, and has a lot of things that it covers. I just wanted to share a couple of pages here, which I think might be a good way to end this, to remind us of a time when after the rise of Episcopalians and sort of a waning, there was again a sort of second rise or a second resurgence in the early 20th century. Just to look at a few of these things here, Henry Chauncey is the guy who founded the Testing Institute, and it talks about what happened with the Episcopal Church and their numbers. Talks about an old split between the old school, old wealth and new wealth in some ways, and talks about how this all sort of came together. And he notes here that, again, the newly rich and the old rich joined together between 1860 and 1900, and Episcopal Church membership, listen to this, in the United States grew by 318%. Again, I'm no mathematician, but that's a lot. That's a big percentage. 318% between 1860 and 1900. Episcopalianism, as he writes, had two main appealing features. To the new capitalists, it offered the opulence of ritual and setting. And to the old mercantilists, it provided a link to England, particularly at a time of uncontrolled immigration, when for them, England had become the place that their ancestors had come from and a way to link back to that. Now, he goes on to note here, not every member of the elite was an Episcopalian, of course, though nearly every member was a Protestant. There was room for some variability of denomination, but still, again, he says it's remarkable how this Episcopalianism had risen. And if you go back to the previous page, again, he talks about how the name he gives to this period and this resurgence and this development was to refer to, he says, the rise of the episcopacy. The rise of the episcopacy. And so again, another moment there where the Episcopal Church came to the forefront in cultural matters and civic matters and educational matters and these sorts of things. And he suggests some of the ways in which that was continued. Last point to make, Chauncey himself and many others made the progression from the Groton School to Harvard and then on to their professional lives and careers. Another person who made that exact same pilgrimage was Franklin D. Roosevelt. Groton, Harvard, then public service. And we'll close with another point of pride perhaps here that we can all take some pride in as Episcopalians. When historians are asked to rank the country's greatest presidents in history, they usually list three at the top: George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. Two of them were Episcopalians. And in that, we might take some denominational pride. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to entertain questions and talk some more.
What was his denomination?
Jefferson is sometimes referred to as a deist. He is really sort of a person off by himself in some ways. He doesn't have a clear religion. He did his own Bible, cutting out all the scenes with miracles and referring to only the historical stuff that's there. So Jefferson is probably safely called a deist, I guess, sort of alone among the founders in some ways.
Historically, we don't know much about George Washington. He didn't have a press secretary.
Right.
The Masonic organization is claiming that he's the founding father of their organization, and that both he and several of his fellow presidents were members of the Masonic, which is a reflection on the symbolism that appears in much of our currency, which are Masonic symbols. Is that historically true?
Yeah, I mean, Washington and Freemasonry in general were very, very prominent actors in the American scene. I talked about those voluntary organizations. Freemasonry was a very, very powerful one. So influential, in fact, that it garnered an opposition movement of anti-Masons and anti-Masonry that became very prominent politically in the 1830s. But yeah, that's part of that movement. And Masons and Masonry are there. Washington was part of that as well. Washington was a real joiner. I mean, he belonged to lots of different organizations and sort of welcomed them all and saw himself as part of all that.
Good politician.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say on the same subject, he was a leader in the Alexandria Lodge, Freemason. So he was not only involved in several churches as a vestryman, but he was also involved in numerous lodges as a master of the lodge and as a leader. And when you describe the things he says, the things he doesn't say, what he does and doesn't do, it sounds very Masonic to me. Because in Masonry, they emphasize one God. They try not to, I should say because I'm a Mason, but we try not to emphasize the particularities of any one religion, because the most important thing is monotheism, science, architecture, and the Enlightenment.
Isn't it true that Washington barely escaped during the Revolutionary War, probably about 2 or 3 assassination attempts?
Yeah, I'm not sure how many, but yes, that's right. His life was sort of always in danger, in peril during the war and from spies and things like that, which is one of the reasons why Washington always credited his escapes to Providence. That was always sort of the way he spoke, the way he thought about that, was that these were examples of God in the world, because he himself had gotten out of so many scrapes, militarily and individually. Rick?
Todd, do you have data on Presbyterian members of the constitutional group, so that, and where the Presbyterians were from? And I guess where I'm coming from is that I read that there were a lot of Presbyterians from Scotland and England and Northern Ireland in particular that basically came to the southern states. And so the portion of those representatives, would not potentially have been Episcopalian. And if that gave some of the impetus behind the arguments that occurred over the Constitution.
Yeah, it could well be. I mean, Madison, for at least much of his life, was a Presbyterian. James Madison was. And part of the reason why Madison was such an active actor in the idea of religious freedom statutes in Virginia was because he was not part of the established Anglican Church. That was the established church in Virginia, but Madison was not part of that. Washington was, but not Madison. In terms of Presbyterians, I don't have numbers off the top of my head about the numbers of the convention or percentages or things like that. So somewhere between, let's say, 30 and 50%, I guess. If Episcopalians are 50 to 70, then somewhat less than that. But there were certainly Presbyterians at that and in other aspects of the new government as well. Yeah, Claire.
Could you speak more to how it was that the Hebrew congregation was deprived of their invaluable rights as free citizens?
Yeah, I think that's a broader statement just about anti-Jewish prejudice and the fear that Jews who were very, very small in number in the United States would be easily targeted, easily discriminated against, and there would perhaps not be much concern on the part of others about that. And I think part of what Washington wants to say in this, and part of what they were asking him essentially to ratify for them, is their value, their equality, their right not only to worship, but their right to be part of the United States on the same footing as everybody else.
Understood, but the statement implies that not only that they're afraid of discrimination, but they have been discriminated. So I'm wondering if...
Oh, their specific case. Yeah, I don't know much about the specific case of that. I mean, this is a very detailed footnote, but it doesn't talk about that. So I don't know if they were reacting in a anticipatory sense, or if they were referring to something specific that had affected them. I just don't know. Let me see if I can find out more about that.
What was the religious composition of the country?
Also very hard to tell. I mean, because there were some people who attended a church, although they didn't belong to it because it had been the established church, obviously, during the colonial period. The disestablishment of churches made it easier for people to choose freely where and how they wanted to worship. But there's an awful lot of flexibility and mobility from denomination to denomination that makes it hard to pin down at any one particular time. The country was overwhelmingly Protestant. I mean, Maryland had been founded as a Catholic country, Catholic colony rather. And there were Catholics, there were Jews, obviously, and a number of other people. But primarily, there's just a long, long list of various Protestant sects, often small in number, often morphing from one to another. So I don't know the exact percentages, and I think it would depend very much on, are we talking 1790 or, because it was not something counted on the early census data either, which tended to be just about who lives where and things like that.
When we hear...
Jeff, can we hold on just one sec here? Let's keep these questions on the microphone.
Okay.
How many colonies were Episcopalian or had established Episcopalian?
Before the revolution.
Churches, 5
Yeah.
colonies.
Yeah.
When we hear all that Washington was doing and involved in and where he went, either he didn't have or didn't need or want, as we do today, secret servicemen with the presidents.
He did not. No, that was not. Secret Service, I'm trying to think of the first president they covered. Was it Theodore Roosevelt, maybe? I think it was Herbert Hoover, even later. Yeah, no, there was no Secret Service protection like that at all. I mean, that's the thing about Abraham Lincoln's assassination. We say, well, how could they have snuck up behind him in a theater? Nobody there. There's no formal protection like that. So no, that made early presidents very much men of the people in a sense, that when they went to a tavern or stayed someplace, anybody could come up and talk to them, anybody could see them, and there was no sort of security like we've come to have today.
Having lived for many years in western frontier of the nation in Massachusetts, where the population was pretty thin in 1740-50, my observation is that there was not much presence of the Episcopal or Church of England. It was more fundamental. There were Unitarians and so forth. And that Episcopalianism was more of an urban and a perhaps southern thing, powerful, but not in New England. Is that true?
Well, New England had Unitarians. They also obviously had Congregationalists, the old Puritans, who were very, very numerous. There were certainly in places like Boston, to your point about urban centers, Episcopal churches there. I mean, Fisher Ames was from Dedham, Massachusetts, which is just outside, sort of greater Boston, we might say. So the Episcopal presence varied from place to place. The depth and the numbers varied from place to place, and therefore the influence as well. And one of the things that delegates at the Constitutional Convention, but also delegates before that at the various Revolutionary era conventions as well, were often most struck by was how different people were from Virginia, where the Anglican Church had been dominant, to Massachusetts, where the Congregational Church had been dominant, to New York, which had a long Dutch influence and all kinds of things there. Those were things that people were struck by. And it's part of what made Americans at the time of the Constitution so concerned about trying to say, if we have all this diversity, they didn't quite use that word, but that's what they were speaking of, all that kind of diversity, could we actually come together as one nation? Or would it be better to have separate confederacies and separate republics because of those kinds of differences? So that's part of what made the challenge of unifying, I think, much harder.
last question. Well, Todd, this has been really wonderful.
Thank you all so much.
very much.
This has been great. Thank you.